Hi everyone, this is William Lee back with my series Life on the Magic Mountain about Thomas Mann's famous novel, The Magic Mountain, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year, and comparing what Mann wrote to the reality of life in Davos in a tuberculosis sanatorium. And Hans Castorp was there between 1907 and 1914 as a fictional character, of course. So I'm also doing a comparison of Castorp with a real life patient at Sanatorium Schatzalp, Grand Duke Dmitry of Russia, and he was there quite a few years later. He arrived in September 1939 and would stay until his death in March 1942. So Castorp, even though he wasn't sick, was there far longer than Dmitri. So this is actually the first installment in this series that I've done not at Schatzalp, not even in Davos. I am in the area of Portland, Oregon, in the United States, which is where I was born and raised, and I filmed this installment while I was at Schatzalp. Rather, I should say, I filmed this section of the series, this entry in the series, but when I tried to watch it recently, I discovered that for whatever reason, it would not play from beginning to end. It kept pausing and jumping around, and I tried it at least 10 times and I couldn't figure out a way. And I watched the other videos that I've already posted and they didn't have that problem. So it wasn't just a momentary problem as I was trying to watch it. So I decided I've been posting these every Friday on YouTube and on the Facebook group Sanatorium Schatzalp, and I decided rather than skip one and go on to the next one that I filmed at Schatzalp, that I would actually just make a new one, briefer. And the original one for this part of the Magic Mountain I had recorded in one of the guest rooms at Schatzalp, formerly a patient's room, of course, and it was room 147, north-facing room, so it would have been less expensive. The more expensive rooms then as now were on the south-facing rooms with the big balconies and the marvelous view across the valley. The north-facing rooms have nice views, but they don't have the really breathtaking view of the mountainscape on the other side of the valley. All right, so this one, I regret not being able to show anything at Schatzalp this time around, or any of the materials that I have there, any of my archive, which I leave behind in Davos. Of course, there's no point to bring it back here and risk luggage getting lost or something like that. But this is one of 2 chapters in the book, well, 3 chapters, where Castorp himself is not in Davos and not at the Berghof Sanatorium. He is actually, this is a biographical chapter about his life before he came, from childhood to before he came to the sanatorium in Davos at the age of 24, I think. So I guess it's all right to be doing this one outside of Schatzalp, even though it's not my preference. So in the last installment, I was talking a bit about the psychology of sanatorium patients and what would have been the ideal, what would have made an ideal patient versus one not so good. And Hans Castorp is told in the book by the head doctor at the Berghof who's meeting him for the first time, the doctor tells him that he can see at a glance that Castorp would be the ideal patient, unlike his cousin Joachim, whom he'd actually come to visit, who is a restless type, and all he wants to do is get back to the flatlands and pursue his career as a soldier. So we will be talking more on that topic, because in this subchapter, which is called At the Tienappels, Hans Castorp's Moral State, it's a continuation of the previous chapter, the one I talked about last time, where we see Hans Castorp's youngest childhood up until about age 7. So he lost first his mother, who died during a pregnancy with what would have been his younger brother or sister, and then his father dying not at all long thereafter of more or less a broken heart, and then he goes to live with his grandfather, an elderly man, and his grandfather dies, I think, about a year and a half after little Hans arrives. And then finally he goes to live in the household of a great uncle. And sorry, I just want to make a note so that I don't forget something. There we go. You see me craning my neck because I'm looking at my notes on my laptop, and my eyes are not that good, unfortunately, even with my glasses. So, what was life like for little Hans Castorp in the great uncle's house? The great uncle was on his mother's side of the family. Obviously, there were no close relatives left on his father's side of the family, because the great uncle isn't usually really the ideal person to take care of a small child. And indeed, his great uncle was a busy man. He was the head of the family's wine business. I think they were more distributors and exporters than they were or importers than they were actual producers. And so it's a busy household. It's a bachelor household. Consul Tienappel is actually a widower, and he has 2 adult sons who are coming and going. And so you bring a little boy of 7 or 8 into this household, and who is going to take care of him? Well, I'm not actually even sure who was taking care of him at his grandfather's house. Certainly it was not his grandfather himself. But in this instance, we're told that he was brought up by a housekeeper who did her best to be sort of a surrogate mother to him, and she had the unusual name of Shaline. And so she was pretty much mother and father to Hans Castorp. And one of the predominant characteristics of the Tienappel household is that everything was immaculate and pristine. There wasn't a single weed in the garden, and butter was only served in fluted balls rather than little pots. And man says that Castorp would not even have considered, or would have only reluctantly eaten butter that was served to him in a pat instead of a little fluted ball. So he's growing up with routine and with a very controlled and well-organized and aesthetically pleasing environment. So that was certainly what he would have found then at the Berghof, and what patients would have found even more so at Schatzalp, because it was the most luxurious of all the sanatoriums, and I'm quite certain they weren't serving butter in pots, but in little fluted balls. And I myself have had butter in little fluted balls at Schatzalp. And so it was also very well regulated, well organized. There was a strict routine, and so Hans Castorp's early life had really prepared him to be the ideal sanatorium resident. All right, so I have read this book about 11 times, and there was something I nonetheless missed. So there is value in reading this book not just 10 times, but 11 times, or actually I'm on my 12th time. And I finally picked something up that I think is huge. So if there are any literary scholars watching this, maybe you can weigh in. But this explains so much about Hans Castorp, and yet I missed it, and most of the reviews and analyses of the book that I've seen have missed it as well. So here is a quote. He was probably, referring to Hans Castorp, he was probably a little anemic from the start, or so Dr. Heidekind said, prescribing for him a nice daily glass of porter to be drunk with his snack when he returned from school. A robust brew, as everyone knows, which Dr. Heidekind believed helped build the blood, and which, however that might be, Hans Castorp discovered, much to his satisfaction, had a calming effect on his spirits and pleasantly assisted him in his proclivity to doze, as Uncle Tienappel put it, when he would sit with his mouth slightly open, dreaming away without a single firm thought in his head. Well, that's Hans Castorp in a nutshell. But I actually find this rather shocking, because here he was, 8 or 9 or 10 years old when this started, being drugged into a stupor every day. So that is one way to deal with having a little boy in a busy household where everybody is engaged in their own activities and there's no mother to take care of him. Yeah, just give him beer. Give him, as the doctor put it, very robust beer. I mean, if I was to have a porter right now without having eaten dinner yet, I would probably sit here in a dozy state too. But this is a little boy. And so, yeah, I'm really a bit surprised that I didn't notice this before. And it's a habit that when he arrives at the Berghof, even before he knows that he's going to stay there longer than the original 2 weeks, it's a habit that he already is anxious to resume. And again, Mann will refer to him sitting there with his mouth slightly open and just sort of dreaming away his life. All right, so another factor perhaps in being the ideal patient. Sedate yourself. Okay, so another reason why Hans Castorp ended up staying at the sanatorium for 7 years. So he's this young man, and Mann emphasizes the fact that he didn't like hard work, and he wasn't very motivated. He just sort of did enough to get by. Well, no wonder. That wasn't originally his choice. It was a habit that the family doctor actually got him into. So he didn't want to work hard. And even though he's a very affluent young man, his uncle Tienappel tells him that by Hamburg merchant standards, it's not good enough. He tells him, and this is a quote, "It's no fun nowadays trying to live off interest unless one has at least 5 times as much as you have. And if you fancy living a nice life here in the city, like the one to which you're accustomed, then you'll have to earn a tidy sum yourself. Take note of that, my boy." All right, yes, indeed, take note of that, my boy. You're not going to be able to live the way I live and the way you're used to living unless you work really hard and accumulate more money. Well, that wasn't definitely not music to Hans Castorp's ears. And guess what? He realized when he got to the sanatorium, and he actually sat down and did the calculations, that he could live there in the manner to which he was accustomed. He could afford to have nice clothes and the expensive cigars that he liked and all the things he wanted without any difficulty at all, just on the basis of his interest. So it cut out all the things that he would have had to pay for in Hamburg, for entertaining, for getting married, for raising a family, all of those things that his interest would not have been enough for. Now he has a chance to live with everything he wants, and according to his calculations, even a surplus left over every year without lifting his finger. So great. And then we have, and I just wanted to mention that in the Schatzalp prospectus for the year 1913, the prices at Schatzalp ranged from 4 francs a night or a day to 20 francs a day. And that was not as all-inclusive as you get the impression when you're reading The Magic Mountain, that he really has, Kastorp really has no other bills, that it covers that what he's paying at the Berghof covers his medical treatment, which he doesn't really need anyway, his meals, several meals a day, 2 breakfasts, so on and so forth, and the only thing he has to pay for is if he wants some extra alcohol or something like that. Well, the reality, at least at Schatzalp, was that you were paying extra for everything. I do think that the basic meals were covered, and the doctor's consultations were covered. But if, for instance, you were going to have a X-ray or an injection, anything like that, you would be paying for each one of those things. And you would be paying to rent a Liegestuhl for your balcony, and you would be paying for, so I have these papers from a patient who was there in 1914, Herr Hutter, an architect from Salzburg, and I was going to show some of his bills, because if he ate an egg, he was paying for the egg, although it probably was the case that he wanted an extra egg. He probably could get, he was probably entitled to a certain number of eggs. But anyway, let's see. So we've covered those 2 things. And then there's one other thing that I talked about last time, the idea that Kastorp had this internal conflict that was brought to the surface by his residency at the sanatorium. And that internal conflict was that he'd been pushed more or less into a career path as an engineer and a shipbuilder. He lived in Hamburg, and his great-uncle had a friend who owned a shipbuilding business, and who suggested that might be a nice career for this boy because Hans Kastorp was very interested in ships. And so Hans Kastorp, in typical fashion, maybe someone came to suggest it to him while he was sitting there in a stupor because of his porter, he goes along with it. And he does fine at school, although he finds it very taxing, and he graduates and he becomes an engineer. And at the time that he leaves to go up and visit his cousin Joachim in Davos, he's about to start an unpaid apprenticeship in the shipbuilding business of this friend of the family. And he's apprehensive about that, because really he is at heart not an engineer and not a shipbuilder, although he's very proud of the technological accomplishments in engineering. At heart, he's really more of an artist, and would he have ever been, did he have enough talent and enough drive to have made a living as an artist? Probably not. But Mann does tell us in the previous chapter and in this chapter that he did very good watercolors. And so here's a quote: "His technical drawings were not quite as good as his watercolor depiction of the Hansa on the high sea, but when the abstract graphics required the sensual addition of a wash or for shading or lively colors, Hans Kastorp proved more skillful than most." So not a genius, but more skillful than most when something sensual was needed in his school, when he's doing drafting and plans and technical plans, he's merely adequate when he's doing something that requires an artistic touch. He's very good at it. Well, at least better than most. So at the Berghof, he's trying out all kinds of different things. He's looking at, he buys all these books, and he's plunging into botany and the human medical issues, and I think even astronomy and religion and philosophy. And he never says that he's rethinking the idea of being a shipbuilder. I mean, he has that training, but he does many times say, well, I should have gone into the church, or I should have done this or that. And he finds out that the head doctor there at the Berghof is himself an artist, not an extremely talented one, but he has some talent, and he's doing paintings. And so in this atmosphere, maybe Hans Castorp is letting a side of himself out that was repressed earlier. And I think that was something, this is just my own personal theory, but I tend to think that maybe that was something. You had so much time to contemplate if you were a patient at a sanatorium, that maybe that was something that happened. That whatever it was in a person's life that they had put off or repressed would start to come to the fore. And I won't talk more about that because I talked about it, I think, in the previous installment. All right, so let's recap what these important points are that we've learned about Hans Castorp and whether or not they would have made him an ideal sanatorium patient. One is that he's basically alone in life. His closest relatives are a great uncle and two adult cousins who are, one is in the Navy and one is fully engaged in the family business, which he'll be inheriting. And that's it, except for Joachim. Okay, so he's alone, so he's not going to have the conflict that a lot of people would have going to a sanatorium, and that would be a big motivator for them to get better and leave the sanatorium, which would be that they're separated from their families, from spouses, from children. Yeah, that would be a big motivator. Okay, he's used to spending his days in a stuporous state. So people were not being sedated in tuberculosis sanatoriums, God forbid, but they were being asked to spend hours every day sitting in a completely quiet state of repose, and they weren't even supposed to read anything or listen to anything on the radio in later years that would get them agitated. And so he's already used to doing that. A lot of people, when they first came to sanatoriums, would find that very, very difficult to adjust to. I mean, not at Schatzalp, but in some of the more strict sanatoriums. The first month you were there, you would lay flat on your bed and you would not be able to read. And if you started to get better, you would be able to read for 15 minutes a day. And the whole idea of the complete bed rest was that it would bring your fever down. And it was thought that anything that excited you, even a little bit, would cause your fever to go up. And there are also references to that in the Magic Mountain. But even if he'd been in a strict sanatorium and had been genuinely sick, Hans Castorp would have had a leg up on other people, on other prospective patients, because he was already used to doing that. Okay, he was used to routine, and that was, of course, very important if you're going to adjust to life in a tuberculosis sanatorium. He had a financial incentive, whereas for most people it was the opposite. They couldn't afford to stay in a sanatorium indefinitely, especially not a sanatorium like Schatzalp. But in Hans Castorp's case, it's actually a way for him to save money. He has the conflict between what he's been sort of pushed into doing for a living and what his natural inclination is in life. And he has been exposed to death. That was the little note I wanted to make. And he has formed a romantic view of death. And so that was something that was not going to bother him the way it may have bothered other people when they first entered a tuberculosis sanatorium and were afraid that there would be death all around them. And that was not, generally speaking, actually the case. But nonetheless, Hans Castorp is very well prepared for that, and he even is proactive about wanting to meet with people who are dying. Okay, and finally, in his case, you would think maybe it would be the opposite, because he never had a mother in his life. And you would think he would be looking for a mother figure. And he is absolutely not. And I wonder if Thomas Mann dropped the ball on that a little bit in relation to Castorp. Because I would conceive of such a person brought up in such a way as being always looking for a mother figure. But Hans Castorp is looking for a father figure, and he finds them at the Berghof. He finds 4 of them. So his 2 mentors, Nafta and Sedembrini, and then the head doctor, Hofrat Behrens, and then a character who comes in toward the end of the book called Herr Pieperkorn. All right, so now let's move on. I've taken up more time than I intended to, but let's move on to Dimitri and do a quick comparison of those points that we just applied to Hans Castorp in relation to him. So they have one foundational thing in common. They're both orphans, and they both had were orphaned more than once, you could say. So in Dimitri's case, his mother died giving birth to him, and then he was raised in his father's household, who, like Tienappel, was a widower and had lots going on in his life and didn't see his children that often. And then when his father was banished from Russia for an injudicious marriage, and the children were left behind in Russia, Dimitri and his sister, they went to live with an uncle and aunt. And the aunt was not a very maternal person. And the uncle was more interested in being a real parent to them, but was quite a martinet and a tyrannical person. And then the uncle was killed violently in 1905. Dimitri was 13, if I remember correctly. And so Dimitri was then very directly exposed to death, just as Hans Castorp had been, but in a form that could not be romanticized. His uncle was truly blown to bits in a terrorist attack. And Dimitri's aunt brought Dimitri and his sister. She was actually outside gathering body parts herself. And then the body, what they were able to retrieve of it, was brought into the palace chapel, covered with a bloody greatcoat. And the children were brought in to witness that and to see that. So, similarity, both of these men were exposed to death at a young age. And difference, Dimitri's conception of death was of quite a bloody kind. Like Castorp, he fights in World War I, and he's involved in a horrific battle in East Prussia in August 1914, where his Russian cavalry regiment is just shredded by German artillery. And they keep charging the German artillery over and over again. And they keep getting ripped to pieces. So he also was there for that. And then he escaped the revolution because he himself had been banished from Russia by the Tsar in 1916. But he heard about all of the things that happened to his family members, including his father, who was shot, and his younger half-brother, and his aunt, who were buried alive in an old mine shaft. So they were thrown down the old mine shaft, then they were shot at, and then it was filled in without anybody waiting to see if they had been killed by the gunshots or the fall or anything like that. So Dimitri's conception of death was very, very different from Hans Castorp's, and not in the least romantic. He certainly was not drugged or sedated as a child. There were maybe times when the people taking care of him would have liked to have been able to do that, because unlike Hans Castorp, he was quite a lively boy. He was a handful. But no, that was not something that was done. He was moved around like little Hans from household to household. But unlike Hans, he had a man and a woman who were taking care of him and his sister. So that was consistent, at least. So no, for Dimitri, it was he was drinking coffee and stealing cigarettes when he was 14. So he was not looking for ways to sedate himself, to say the least. He did have this routine that he had really no control over. Even I've been reading his diaries for when he was 14 years old, and he did have a pretty strict routine. He was told when to go to bed. He was told when to take a bath. He was told when to do this, that, and the other thing. And so he certainly had got used to that. And one of the issues that he had before, in the years before he came to Schatzalp, was that when he didn't have structure in his life, he tended to drift. And the people who loved him were enough concerned about that when he ended up going to Schatzalp, they were relieved. Duke! Not so much from the medical point of view, because some of them didn't even believe he was sick, which he absolutely was, but for the idea that he would now be in a structured environment with a routine that he would be asked to adhere to, and that would keep him from sort of just drifting into a life that has no direction. All right. Unlike Hans Castorp, again, originally the outlay for being in the sanatorium was not easy for him, because one of the things that Mann doesn't talk about, and it's not the case at the Berghof, and I don't know how many of the sanatoriums in Davos it would have been the case in, but at Schatzalp you were asked to pay for a year. You were asked to pay a year in advance. And the sanatorium would then deposit that money in an account, and they would take your fees every month out of that money, or every 2 weeks, and you would receive interest on the money that had not yet been used. Well, when Dimitri arrived at the sanatorium, he had been divorced by his wealthy American heiress wife, and so he was in a bit of a bind financially. And the story is that somebody that he himself had lost lots of money to, because he was a compulsive gambler, had then stepped up and said, okay, I'm gonna pay this for you. And then later, not too long later, not too much later, his ex-wife, started sending him money, sending him a sort of allowance from the U.S. every month. And so then he was able to feel more secure and to be on a solid footing. Okay, so I think we have covered everything. So Hans Castorp and Dimitri were really different despite having both been orphans. The other points in common that we just went over, they were very, very different people, and Castorp was an ideal patient. Dimitri was a good patient so far as it went. He was able to adjust to that routine, and one of the friends of the family reported to his sister that he was conforming to the rules. And so he wasn't a horrible patient, although he was always bored and he would get depressed, and the doctor would have to, do something to raise his spirits. But he was a restless type, and it was more difficult for him. And here I thought I would only be going about 20 minutes with this one, but I've gone 35, and so I hope the next installment will be the one that I did at Schatzalp. But we will see. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.